First, let me note that the National Endowment for the Humanities is proud to have joined several other distinguished institutions, including the Norwegian government, the Foundation to Promote Open Society, and the Ford and MacArthur Foundations in being a major funder of the Women, War, and Peace series that continues to rack up professional honors. The series, as its individual parts, received 2 Gracie Awards, a Television Academy Honor, 2 Overseas Press Club Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Award for the Best TV Documentary in International Affairs, and the Robert Spears Benjamin Award for the Best Reporting in any medium on Latin America. The National Endowment's involvement is an example of our commitment and a new Bridging Cultures Through Film initiative to encourage deeper consideration of international topics in history, jurisprudence, and culture. In this case, the film we have just witnessed not only shines a spotlight on one of the darkest corners of war, the travesty suffered by women, but on contemporary efforts to seek justice through new reaches of international law. Our panelists this afternoon are Refuge Hadzik, who is Director of Communications at the International Center for Transitional Justice. As a journalist, and you've seen him on the film, filmmaker and scholar, Hadzik has focused his work on post-war justice issues, especially in the former Yugoslavia, Lebanon, and East Timor. Pamela Hogan is an executive producer as well as writer for the Women, War, and Peace series. Previously, she helped produce award-winning documentaries on a variety of subjects ranging from environmental themes to debates about the H-bomb. A member of both the Directors and Writers Guild of America, Ms. Hogan has been at the forefront of making PBS's Emmy-winning documentary series, Wide Angle, a standard setter for global women's issues. Diane Orent-Lichter recently served as deputy to the Ambassador at Large, Stephen Rapp, in the Office of War, Crimes, and Issues at the Department of State. She is currently a professor and co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the Washington College of Law at American University. Judge Patricia Wald now serves as chair of the Open Society Institute's Criminal Justice Initiative. Judge Wald served as a member of the judicial panel for the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and prior to that, as an Assistant Attorney General of the United States and Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Moderating the panel will be Kelly Dawn Askin, who is a Senior Legal Officer in the Open Society Justice Initiative. She has taught at Notre Dame, American University, Harvard, Yale, and Oxford, and written extensively on war crimes against women and on the place of women in international humanitarian law. Professor Askin, panelists, please take your seats.
As you can see, it's an extremely powerful film. It's a part of a 4 series, and if you have a chance, I strongly encourage you to see the ones that focus on the wars and women in Afghanistan, Colombia, and Liberia. Before turning to the panelists, I've been asked to say a few remarks about the significance of this particular trial represented in this film. As it was very clearly indicated, I came to testify is particularly compelling because it covers the landmark Kunarat's trial when the Yugoslav Tribunal prosecuted rape as a crime against humanity for the first time, and it also prosecuted enslavement They didn't have jurisdiction over the term of sexual slavery, and it also prosecuted sex crimes for torture as both war crimes and crimes against humanity. And as indicated in February 2001, 8 years after the Yugoslav Tribunal was established, 3 accused were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for various forms of sexual violence. At the ICTY previously, there had been a couple other war crimes cases that had focused on victims of sexual violence against both males and females, the Celabici case and the Frenzia case in 1998. And at that time, the Rwanda Tribunal, also in 1998, had already convicted Jean-Paul Ekyusu of rape as a crime against humanity and rape as an instrument of genocide. Combined, these cases have set a strong and durable precedent. Additionally, the ICTY and the ICTR have had over a dozen other cases, including 2 which Judge Wald sat on, that have also recognized sex crimes as things like persecution, inhumane acts, outrages upon personal dignity, cruel treatment. In addition, the Special Court for Sierra Leone has convicted accused in 2 separate cases of rape, sexual slavery, and the crime of forced marriage. Next month, the Taylor judgment comes out, and he's also been charged with these crimes, and so we're hopeful that the former president will be convicted of some very serious crimes, including sex crimes. The International Criminal Court, which is the only permanent treaty-based global war crimes court, the ICC statute has formally, in large part to these cases that were taking part in The Hague while the Rome negotiations were going on, has formally recognized in its statute rape and forced prostitution, sexual slavery, forced sterilization, forced pregnancy, gender persecution, and trafficking in women and children as exceptionally serious crimes. Of the 15 cases that have been brought before the ICC in the context of 7 situations under investigation in Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, the Darfur region of Sudan, Kenya, Libya, and the Ivory Coast, all situations, though not necessarily every case, all situations contain some form of charges for sex crimes. The magnitude of sex crimes being prosecuted in so many of these different courts is unprecedented and cannot be overemphasized. 15 years ago, there was debate about whether rape is even a war crime. So in my view, more so than any other cases in history, it was the Ekyusu judgment, the Rwanda Tribunal, and the Kunaret's judgment here before the Yugoslav Tribunal, which both established the leading precedent on gender crimes in international law and shifted public opinion about the use of rape in war. The world has gradually come to understand that rape and other forms of sexual violence are not simply inevitable side effects of war, but are instead committed intentionally as powerful weapons of war, terror, and destruction. Now I'd like to turn to the panelists, particularly the ones who didn't direct the film. Can you just give us your gut reaction to the film in 30 seconds or less from both your own unique legal perspective and as a woman or a man watching survivors testify about rape and sexual slavery? Do you want to start, Judge Watt?
Sure. I'll try to do it in 30 seconds. I went over to the tribunal in 1999 and stayed there to the end of 2001. So I was there during the time that the FOCA trial was being tried and was simultaneously involved in some other trials with sexual crimes involved. I tell you why I like the movie. I like the movie because it put it in context. And I saw again and again in the cases I had something very similar to what we saw in the movie. And that is that you had villages and you had towns where people lived together, where the Serbs and the Muslims lived together. They intermarried, they worked together. And all of a sudden, within a period of a year or something, the nationalist trend came down like a bolt out of the sky. And you had people testifying before me, as you heard them in the movie, that, gee, I used to work next to these people, we used to go to parties together, and all of a sudden, they were the enemy. And I think there's, I don't want to get preachy here, there's a little lesson for all of us in that, how quickly, if you let another part of the country become the other, then they lose their humaneness and terrible, terrible things can happen. That, together with later questions, I'll get into some of my reactions to actually being in the courtroom and seeing these witnesses, in my case, even though they weren't the same witnesses as in the FOCA trial. But I think the problems of trying a criminal case and trying a criminal case fairly, because it was the credibility of this tribunal was at stake. People said, you won't be able to have a fair trial in that situation. People are still criticizing Nuremberg as having been a high-class lynch mob. And so I remember Goldstone, who was the first prosecutor at the ICTY, before I went over there, he had left, and I met him, and I said, what's the one or two things I should remember or try to learn the most? And he said, it is that the trial, just as Justice Jackson said in Nuremberg, has to be fair. And finally, I liked the movie because it, even though, as it pointed out, big steps were made in the recognition of these crimes in international law, yet for the people who had to make those sacrifices, it was not so easy. And we heard that story over and over again. I didn't preside. I was on the trial bench that heard the first genocide trial of Srebrenica in the ICTY. And we had those stories of people going back a couple of years later and getting no recognition, being as it were, still treated as the kind of other. As I think the German woman prosecutor said, sometimes takes decades. It took 3 generations or more for the Germans to acknowledge and for new generations to acknowledge the terrible things that happened. So maybe there's a bit of hope in that. So altogether, I thought the movie was very balanced in showing these terrible crimes, the courage of the women, but in the context of what came before and after.
Sure. Is this on? Okay. First, Pam, again, congratulations. It's, as Kelly said, a really powerful film, but it just does tremendous justice to the subject we're covering. And let me, in 30 seconds, say a couple of things about what I found so powerful about this. And I'm going to begin by playing off of Peggy Kuo's comment about how this was a trial that lacks a face. And although the witnesses who came to testify were digitally disguised, they had no trouble finding their voice. And I think your film makes that come through so clearly. As Refik said in the film, they were enormously courageous, but what I think you really captured was how determined they were to speak the truth. They really, it was, and I've seen this in many of the witnesses and victims I've spoken to in Bosnia, it was important to them that the truth be known, and I kept hearing that in your interviews. And so I thought that was really beautifully captured and terribly important to capture, because many of us during the war heard constantly in the news reporting about the rape that women would be too ashamed to come forward to testify, that their overwhelming experience of rape was that of shame. And these women, I heard them say, and I was very struck by this in the interviews you did with them, I wasn't ashamed in the courtroom. I wanted to tell the truth. I wanted people to know. So I thought that was awfully important to capture, and you did it so effectively. The other thing I would just say very briefly, as Kelly really brilliantly captured in her brief introductory remarks, this was a legal landmark in many ways, and other cases have both stood on the foundation it laid and developed it further. But as Kelly has often chronicled, it's so difficult to count on courts to pay the kind of attention that the Fochet trial paid to the crimes of sexual violence. There are a lot of reasons we might get into later, but we have to continue to ensure that crimes of sexual violence receive the attention they deserve.
Thanks.
Well, first I will say, just watching this film again and hearing my esteemed co-panelists, a thought occurred to me that it might constitute almost a curse to say to someone, may your life be a subject of a legal landmark someday. And that is what, to me, sort of comes after watching this film for the third time. But I am, in a way, thankful that we were, and when I say we, I'm talking about my country, my people, and regardless of their ethnicity, unfortunately, I have to emphasize that we were subject of international law, because many crimes, as we speak, as we sit here, go unpunished, and they go unnoticed by law of their own country or international law. But in 10 seconds, when Pam and her team approached me to help with this film, I have to say I was reluctant, because I have seen countless people come to Bosnia in search of good material, good story. You know, let's have some gore, let's have some tears, and they do, because unfortunately we have a surplus of stories like that. But since day one, I've realized that this was something else. This was something different in terms of wanting to really understand first and then tell the story. And for that, I'm thankful to Pam and her team.
Pam, as director of this award-winning film, can you share a little with the audience what your primary objective was in seeking in both the war in Bosnia and Focha as part of the Women, War, and Peace series?
Well, Women, War, and Peace is really about the impact of war on women, and then the evolving role that women are playing, often under-recognized as sort of challenging the rules of engagement and changing the rules of engagement. And it's a shocking fact, but it's actually more dangerous in today's conflicts in many places to be a woman than it is to be a soldier. And 90% of casualties in today's wars are civilians, and the majority of those are women and children. So we were doing an enormous amount of research to figure out how to tell these big stories in 5 films. And frankly, when we came across the story of the Kunarats trial, what had happened to these women in Focha, and then what had happened to them has always unfortunately happened to women in war, but what they did about it was different. And the courage that it took for them to step forward, and the resilience of their spirit in doing that, we just thought that it was an important moment of history that had never been told. And I was just kind of waiting there to be told. And you know, the great thing about making a film is that it does become part of the permanent narrative, the permanent record. And if you don't tell the stories, sometimes it's as though they never happened. So it was, we felt very humbled and I guess proud to be able to tell that story.
Judge Wald, as you alluded to, you were at the tribunal during the time the Coonrats trial was going on, and you sat on the also groundbreaking Coonrats and massacre camp cases, both of which had components of sex crimes in them. Can you discuss how judges balance the inherent tension between the rights of victims and the rights of the accused to a fair trial?
Yes. Excuse me. I alluded to the fact that a judge, and I think it's even especially important in an international court, and in this court, which was the first one after 50 years in Nuremberg, it had to establish its credibility as a court, not as just as a platform or a performance arena. And so the U.S., which had led the movement to establish the ICTY, had actually had a lot to do with drafting the rules, and the rules were very much like our own criminal rules: burden of proof, cross-examination, et cetera. Let me just point out a few things. What we saw in the film, we saw the witnesses and we saw the prosecutors, who obviously were very sympathetic to the witnesses who were doing their case. What you didn't see, and I couldn't attend the FOCA trial since I was across the hall in a different trial, but I could speak from the different trial I was in. It was not just a come and give a speech, tell us about your experiences, come and give a performance. It could be a grueling kind of experience. And based on what I saw in our own courtroom, one of those women, not only were they brought from their hometowns and they had to stay in The Hague, they had to stay in particular places under the witness protection unit, which is a good thing. But if they would get on the stand, you saw all of the makeover visibility and that, but they had to go in, they had to walk by the people who had raped them. They had to go face to face with their accusers. And in one case, a prison camp, you saw those emaciated pictures in the very beginning. One of those camps was the one that we tried in the Omarska. Kelly worked on it too, though she's too modest to say so. But you had to go by the very people that had raped you. And let me tell you, those people, but at least in our trial, were not always civil. We had several incidents in the courtroom where the defendants in the dock would actually start, saying something. And they'd say it in Serbo-Croat. So the judges, all of us, three judges, one was Portuguese, I was American, and one was Egyptian. We didn't know what they were saying. But those women who came by knew what they were saying. Fortunately, the translators did too, so in many cases we were able to reprimand. But they had to look at those people and actually become, the subject. Not only that, but they did have to be cross-examined by defense counsel. And that what often happened in those cases was women might have given a statement in the field investigation a year or 2 years before, and that statement would come up, and then they would be cross-examined and say, but you said in the statement this, and now you're saying that. And so they would have to undergo not just a kind of, I won't say attack because it's part of the trial process, but it is a kind of formalized attack upon their credibility. And I know that Kelly will remember we had, in one case we worked on together, it was really tragedy, but it I think brought to the foreground this kind of conflict which you do have if you're going to run a trial like a trial, according to what we believe are the tenets of a trial, at the same time that you're dealing with this terrible human situation. In this case, because there had been 3 prison camps, and we were trying the people who were the authorities in one of them, but very often women, they weren't just women's camps, these were camps of mixed men and women, but some of the women had been transferred at various times from one of these prison camps to the other. So when they came to testify, a particular witness, it's now Well, by that time, it was 8 or 9 years after the event. And when it comes, she had probably been raped by dozens of men in 3 different camps, in all sorts of circumstances. But we only had one defendant. We actually had 5, but relevant to her, we only had one defendant in the dock. And so she would get cross-examined when she attempted to relate about the details of it, and she would get mixed up. I mean, she'd been raped 40 times by more than that men, and so, yes, she would get the details mixed up. It would look as though she didn't remember precisely what happened with that single defendant out of all the rapes. So we were faced with the dilemma. Here's somebody who clearly a terrible, terrible human tragedy had happened, but here's a defendant who, under the rules of evidence and trial, you can only convict him if indeed you can have the evidence that what happened can be directly traced to him. We had many of those kinds of things that came up in the tension. I think we tried in most cases to do our best, but inevitably, very often you were left with the feeling that the terrible human tragedy. Perhaps that is the essence of why the film is so important. It can be put out there in bas relief by itself, as opposed to having to be, siphoned through the trial process. Nonetheless, I think it was, like everybody else, it was terribly important to establish those crimes as crimes which rose to the dignity of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even instruments of genocide. We actually had, at one point, when somebody was testifying about a rape in one of the cases that I sat on, one of the defense counsel who came from the region there said, well, we don't think this should be here at all because the charter of the tribunal says that you should go after only the most serious crimes. And just ordinary, rape is just not that kind of a serious crime. I also want to just mention one thing which I think is important too. There were Women International supportive women's groups which really did an excellent job of even getting ready for this tribunal. For instance, when the rules came up, and believe me, the rules of trial are just as important in international justice as they are in our own courts. One of them is the famous Rule 96. Rule 96 was, I think it's fair to say, pushed, supported by women's groups. What it did was take what most of us would consider the most progressive jurisprudence in our own domestic rape cases and transport it over into theirs. Namely, for instance, you couldn't go into the background of a particular rape victim. And believe me, some of the defendants over there learned fast, the defense counsel, and they tried to do that. They'd say, well, didn't you have this, and that happened in your local community before you ever became a war victim? That got ruled out by Rule 96. Rule 96 also said that the coercion, which is required in most definitions of rape, did not have to be a physical coercion. It could be the coercion that came from being in the custody of somebody who had complete control over you, who either threatened you or threatened those near and dear to you. Because we had defense counsel who would get up there and say, well, under our Serbian law, you can't be convicted of rape if you have no physical abrasions to show that you resisted. Unless you physically resisted to the point that that resistance can be shown, it's not rape. So having their work in getting the Rule 96, which governed the rape trials and the evidence in rape, ahead of their in time, I think saved a lifetime. Well, that's enough.
Thanks very much. Diane, you've dealt with victims and witnesses of horrific crimes as an investigator and a researcher. Went on the ground in Bosnia and Serbia to investigate the impact of the ICTY on those countries for your very impressive and detailed reports. Did you get a sense of why people would agree to subject themselves to the gut-wrenching ordeal of testifying before international local courts about crimes committed during the war?
Sure. I think it was several reasons, and obviously people are individuals, so it varies, but several sort of stood out. One, this is going to sound really obvious to you, but it was not that obvious to people who are experts in the field of transitional or international justice. People talked a lot about the importance of justice after something this terrible. And they would say after something this terrible, there's a need for, literally just a need for justice. The reason that was surprising is after the IC2I had operated for some years, a vast and I think important critical literature developed. Victims' experience of justice from the tribunal is by no means ideal, and Refik may have more to say about this. They have many complaints. They complain about the length of trials, the sentences, and a lot of other things. And what they wanted me to understand is, despite all that, it was fundamentally important to get justice. So straightforward, but not always recognized. And they were passionate about that. Secondly, there was often expressed a moral duty, a sense that they had a responsibility to bear witness. And they had a responsibility to bear witness not for themselves, as certainly not just for themselves, but for the others who had endured crimes and who weren't going to be able to testify, and for those who didn't survive, and that was often emphasized. And it was really profoundly felt and very often articulated. Sort of bundled up with all of that is a point that I think many of the witnesses articulated in the film, in which Refik articulated very articulately, very eloquently, as he always is, toward the end, which it's about the truth. And again, it seems so simple. It's hard to grasp why this is so important to the survivors. But over and over again, I heard them say, it's important to be able to go and to say, and then to hear a court say in its judgment, this and that happened. This happened to me, and to have that established for history. So I would say those are the most often expressed reasons I heard.
Thanks so much. Refik, when you sit and hear about young girls held in sexual slavery being sold for cash and some soap, there's so many competing reactions, anger, frustration, how can human beings do this to others, hopelessness. What's happened to the female victims from Foča and elsewhere in Bosnia whose story is represented by the film? And, what can you say now, some 20 years later, about their experiences and their lives today?
Well, I think I might start answering that question with one piece of information that will not be apparent. This film came out last year, in 2011. By that time, Zoran Vukovic had already been in Foča for 3 years, free, after being released, after serving 2/3 of his sentence, and after being greeted as somewhat of a hero upon his return from prison. The women who testified, and a vast majority of women who were victims of his crimes and Kunarat's crimes and crimes of others, as mentioned in the film itself, who are still free, do not live in Foča. They have not returned. The phrase that Pam used was, they live at a safe distance, and I would say that is a very important, if sobering fact. They do not feel safe back there. They cannot not only achieve acknowledgement of the community in terms of the community accepting them and ensuring their rights. Because let's be clear, these trials have not happened in a vacuum. These people have rights that extend to the right to the truth, to know exactly what happened to their loved ones, the right to reparations, the right to compensation and the care, as they have suffered greatly and still endure the impact, and then the right to safety, security, protection, and dignity. And in Focha, not only do they don't have these rights, but we could see in the film what the response was to a very simple attempt to have a place of horror that they endured marked as such. So I would say that therein lies the answer as to what the, if you want, the payoff for their bravery has been. Because I would add to what Diane said, in addition to the motives of basically wanting to see justice done and wanting to see it done most of all for those who have died, there were some very real reasons. And first of all, if people ever contemplated to go back and live where they lived, where their homes are, they did not want to live next to those who have killed their loved ones, who had raped them. So they wanted to see them in prison, and they've realized that the only way to have that happen was to testify, to come forward. But unfortunately, I have to say that this payoff, due to different reasons about which we can go into more detail later on, has never materialized. So not only are they not regarded as heroes that they are, but those who have done this to them are regarded as heroes in places that they live. And at best, they are wheeled out by supposed defenders of their national interest when it is profitable for their political agendas to say, oh, look what they have done to us, to further division and so on. So in summing up, I would say that today they are worst off in the society still, after first having endured what they've endured and then having contributed so greatly to what will be and has to be a lasting record of what happened and an attempt at getting justice. Unfortunately, and this would be the continuation of my sentence in the film when I said we should ask them whether they feel that they got justice, I would say no.
Wow, that's a, I'm going to sort of flip the question and go back to Pat Wald. The ICTY is also often criticized for giving fairly low sentences for exceptionally egregious crimes. Can you talk a little about why international courts often do give lower sentences than domestic courts, and certainly at least U.S. courts?
Yeah, well, I can. Some of this may be my own speculation, but remember, the ICTY and the international courts, the ICC too. But most of these courts, you start off with the fact that it was a given that no death penalty. They couldn't have any death penalty for it at all. So there was also no sentencing statute. I mean, you know, in our own domestic situation, Congress decides what the maximum and minimum are. Judges may have some discretion in between. But it was basically up to the judges to go between 0 and life sentence. And these judges came from all different countries, which had all different laws. Now, it's well known that the U.S. is the most harsh sentencer in the world and has the greatest rate of incarceration. So you would find that although the ICTY statute, its charter said we should look at what the relevant countries in the region were giving. We weren't bound by that. But when you did look, you would find that some countries, in Serbia, for instance, at one point, maximum for anything, a murder or anything, was 40 years. And so that there were many different experiences from other countries, none of which mostly went up. But also behind the scenes, I'll tell you what was really happening with some of the cases, and one of the ones I was on, and that is that realizing that they had from 0 up to life sentence, at that time, the 3 master war criminals, alleged war criminals, Mladic, Karadzic, and Milosevic, right, had not been apprehended. And so the judges would say, we're not going to give the ultimate to this particular criminal. We had a defendant found guilty of at least being a perpetrator in the Srebrenica massacre, 8,000 young boys and men killed in a single week. We're not going to give the maximum of life here because then there wouldn't be anything left for those big guys when they came. No, they literally, some of them reasoned along these lines. They were trying to create their own tiers. That's some of the sort of legal, technical reasons why I think. But look, Nuremberg, everybody was out. Every Nuremberg defendant was out of jail except one by 10 years, 10 or 11 years after the trials. There is this thing that happens where, and these courts, the ICTY, not the ICC, were temporary courts. Judges came and go in 4 or 5 years, et cetera. You know, they might bring down a sentence, then they were gone in 4 or 5 years afterwards. And the whole court would eventually be gone. So there wasn't the kind of building up of a sentencing precedent, et cetera, that you would get in a domestic court. But I think those are the legal reasons. But I think you've touched upon already the real reasons is that the one thing they hoped that the international courts would do, apart from finding truth, giving people a chance to tell their story, was they were supposed to be a factor for reconciliation of the warring parties. I think we have to say the jury is not in on that yet, whether they, in fact, it looks as though it'd be a long time if it ever does come in, as to whether or not when you actually, transpose it into the courtroom scene, get a verdict, that really reconciles the parties. I think the reconciliation in those civil wars has to come from many, many different education factors. It's not going to come from the trials itself.
I have a series, quite a number of questions, but I've been instructed to instead open it up to the audience. So what I'd like you to do is you need to have a microphone. So we have a couple of microphones in the room. So just make sure you go to one, and you need to speak into the microphone because this is being recorded.
Hi, my question is for the filmmaker. Given the fact that more than 25% of the war crimes convictions that spun out of that conflict were actually Croatians and Bosniaks, did you have any misgivings about employing the very good versus evil Hollywood narrative?
Oh, in other words, the fact that we didn't go into crimes that Bosniaks committed in the film?
And Croatians.
And Croatians.
More than 25% of the war crimes convictions. Yeah.
Yeah, there are, it was a very complicated war and a lot, there were atrocities on all sides. We were focusing on what happened to the women in this campaign of ethnic cleansing that was carried out by the Serbs and the Serb army. And, we were telling the story, about that. And so we were focusing on that narrative.
Hi, I have a question I assume would be for Refik. I know with the ICTR there was some complaints about it being as far away as even Arusha, and Rwanda not feeling some of the justice from that. Did you have that same sense that it either wasn't publicized or that was something that was happening far away, so it wasn't really real to them, or something that it wasn't as effective because of its location?
Yes, but definitely the gap between the tribunal and its constituency, I use that term, was always very serious, and not only in terms of geographical distance, in terms of the fact that it operated in different languages according to different rules, but also due to the fact that somehow it happened outside of the context of the post-war reconstruction. Because just this idea that the court was supposed to reconcile us, I mean, was completely devoid of any understanding of what was going on the ground, because the three people who signed the Dayton Agreement, one of them ended up in The Hague, two others were under the tribunal's investigation, and the dynamics in the region were largely against the tribunal, or at least against its impact. So all these factors resulted in this unfortunate outcome, and that is that the tribunal's verdicts had enormous impact internationally in terms of development of international law, but when it comes to communities that the tribunal was supposedly created to serve, the impact was not as significant. And I would say there are various factors at play there, but one of them also is, in my humble opinion, in the fact that the tribunal did not exactly see these people as its constituents, but rather the constituencies were in Washington, on East River, in Brussels. That is where we had to go to justify our budget. That is where we had to go to ask for more time. That is where we had to go to ask for judges. But the people that had the most invested somehow ended up being evidence material rather than constituents. And that I believe is one of the primary reasons why there was no parallel track that would take into account what is it that is happening on the ground, what is the impact that we are having. Outreach program was established only 6 years into tribunal's life. The first press release in the languages of the people that it was serving was issued only 6 years after the tribunal was established. So therein, I would say, lie these root causes of this gap, not only in the geographical distance.
I'm Diana, and I'm from Bosnia, and I spent whole war in Bosnia. So I'm not going to tell anything about movie because it's been said a lot. I just wanted to say that it's so important to make such a movie, or this kind of a movie. It is so important because it's important to tell to the people, to the world, what happened during the war in Bosnia, and particularly what happened to women during that war. So for the purpose of telling the truth, and for the purpose of giving some kind of respect to those women who went to the court and witnessed and testified, I think that is so important. So simply as a Bosnian woman, I want to thank you for making such a movie, Refik and all the other friends who helped. Thank you.
I'd just like to mention that Andy Fredericks, the editor of the film, is with us today. And just
Rafik, could I just ask you one question, because your last statement was so evocative. And that is, it would lead what you said, and I agree with a great deal of what you said, that would lead one to say, well, the right place to have these trials is in the countries and the regions where it happened. And indeed, there's always been, one of the main reasons the International was created, or at least one of the justifications was that when you have countries which are still at war or have just recovering and transition from war, you just don't have either, sometimes you don't have the physical facilities like in Sierra Leone, or sometimes the feelings are still so raw you can't carry on. But that, you should, that's really the ideal place. And you have seen the development of some of these trials, and it was mentioned in the film, in the war chamber in the Bosnian courts and some of the Serbians. I'd be interested in your reaction, whether that's succeeding. Is it doing a better job than we did?
I have to say that there was this upward curve, and now we are on a decline. And the primary reason for that, again, I would say, is in this vacuum in which trials took place, because, and I will be very brief, the comparison with Nuremberg and what Hildegard was talking about, that it takes decades. We cannot discount what happened parallel to Nuremberg trials in terms of education about what happened in Germany of German people, in terms of linking the development and the Marshall Plan and everything that happened in one big package. In Bosnia, and let's not forget, there was an international intervention on the ground in every sense, military, political, economic. The ICTY was very often seen by these international governors in Bosnia as a problem, because all of a sudden it would infringe upon their political agenda. So what we have seen is that at the establishment of the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber, we had this chance that the process will be truly taken home, and that we will truly have an opportunity to see justice happen and learn and achieve a reckoning, a true reckoning with what happened in Foča. But today, as we speak, there is a motion by the strongest political party among Bosnian Serbs before the Bosnian parliament to abolish Bosnian War Crimes Chamber. There is a tendency to deny facts established at the ICTY about Srebrenica genocide, about other crimes. There is back this tendency, and I have to say, not only in the Bosnian Serb political circles, but everywhere, including the highest religious leaders like the Bosnian Grand Mufti Mustafa Ceric, which is a tendency to embrace the perpetrator from your own group rather than the victim from the other group. And I have to say it comes from simply leaving the tribunal's work in the courtrooms in The Hague and not making sure that they are truly impacting on the society and its moral reconstruction, I would say, reconstruction of its values first and foremost.
Say something about that. Refik always keeps me honest whenever I'm tempted to say too many positive things about the impact of the ICTY. But two things. One is that when I did interviews with survivors in Bosnia and would hear their version of the type of thing that Refik just said, and it was always passionate and always perfectly rooted in reality, I would ask, in light of all of this, do you think, in retrospect, it was a mistake to have created the ICTY? Did it raise false expectations? Did it divert attention from other needs that are more urgent? And to a person, they always said, and I'm afraid Refik may break my record in a minute, but they always said, oh, no, 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 you've misunderstood me. That's not at all what I meant. If it weren't for the ICTY, there would not have been any justice, and there wouldn't have been this, and there wouldn't have been that. They wanted it to be better, and they expected more than the ICTY we now understand could possibly have delivered by itself. But so I just wanted to sort of balance that piece of the very important perspective out. And I also think that I would never want to be the person to have to go out and make the case that the ICTY has contributed to reconciliation. The facts wouldn't be easy to marshal. And I would rather make the case that a whole lot more needed to be done other than trials, and that didn't get the attention that was necessary. But I do think that one potentially relevant comparison to Nuremberg in Germany is the one that the prosecutor made. There was a generational change in Germany before the lessons of Nuremberg were readily embraced by German citizens. You know the challenges to acknowledgement so much better than I do in Bosnia, but I'm constantly struck by this just inexplicable fact that you go to a place like Foča, as I have, after the ICTY has done this marvelous program there to educate people about what was established factually in the Kunerats case. And everybody seems profoundly moved, and they sort of seem to understand for the first time what really happened and to grasp the horror of it. And then you go back 2 years later, and there's a lot of, I didn't encounter quite so much denial. I saw more acknowledgement, but a lot of defensiveness. I don't know when it will be possible for the next generation to say with more distance, this happened and it was terrible and I'm ashamed. But I'm not completely convinced yet that the ICTY's legacy won't contribute in some way to reconciliation.
Just one sentence that I just wanted to add to this. That one factor, too, is you take the massacre of Srebrenica, 8,000 people, young boys and men killed in a single week in 10 different locations. Plus, the war is still going on at the time the tribunal is actually, the tribunal had been set up by the time Srebrenica took place. And then, but the International Tribunal was able to amass the people that went out and excavated all of those and found all those bodies. I don't think any of those warring countries who were still in war or just coming out, you never would have gotten that truth that that everybody agrees is so necessary had you not had the resources that the International Tribunal had to just go out. We had those people coming in, and showing us the pictures, the skulls, everything else. Because at that point, the Serbs were saying, no, there wasn't any massacre. We just had normal kinds of combat going on, and these people were killed in combat. It wasn't until you actually had the resources to bring in the bodies, which showed they had been blindfolded and their hands had been tied behind their backs. It's just a small point, but it gets to the truth, which we all agree.
And I promised 3 sentences just to set the record straight. I do believe that ICTY is the best thing that happened to us since 1991. There is no doubt in my mind, like Judge Wall just said, we would not know 90% of things that we know as a fact. They would still be subject of a very vicious debate. As it is, there are attempts to revise history and deny what was established. My cry is for what the tribunal has done to be used, to be understood as crucial by those who still have the power to impact the Bosnian society. Because talking about the next generation, what I'm afraid of is that we are raising another generation of soldiers. because these young people are growing up on narratives of hatred, division, without what I had and my generation had, and that is the experience of the other. They are separated. And what I am hoping for is that what the tribunal has done and these facts that were established and will stand the test of time will become a subject of an effort to come together and to face what happened. And by no means am I trying to say that the tribunal should not have been established or that it is not a good thing, that on the contrary.
So we have time for one? No? One more and very quick responses. Do we have one more? Okay.
Hi, my question is for Judge Wald. I guess as a man you can relate to female rape up to a certain point, but I mean there's a barrier you cannot cross because you're not a woman and you don't understand it. I guess as a woman it's much more painful to see this. So how do you bring being a woman to a judge? I mean, how do you achieve objectivity in order to not prejudge the guys you are actually supposed to judge fairly?
Yeah, well, I have two answers to that. One is, I'm glad you asked the question because I didn't get a chance to make another point. I think it is very important in these tribunals, in all of them, to have I won't say a quota or a proportion, but to have women in key positions. Now, that did happen to some degree in the ICTY. I was one of two women judges when I was there. You saw Judge Mumba, who led the FOCA trial, who was there when I was there. And in fact, it's interesting because Judge Mumba, there had been attempts by defense counsel, I'm not sure in the FOCA trial, but in one of her, in the Forenzia trial, to have her disqualified because she had been a very vocal proponent in the earlier World Women's Commission on the Status of Women. In other words, she had established a reputation, indeed, as a advancer of women's, and they thought that made her biased. That was considered and rejected, rightfully so, by the tribunal. But 2 points on that. You saw Peggy Coe was one of the prosecutors, and there were some women prosecutors, and indeed the two out of the 4 ICTY prosecutors to date, 2 were women, Louise Arbor and Carla Del Ponte. Now, I did encounter from some of the prosecutors that I got to know while I was there was still a feeling that there weren't enough women way down at the bottom at the investigative stage, because the persons who go out in the field and begin to get the original witness statements and find out what really happened, there was some feeling that perhaps, at least in the early days, they weren't enough sensitive to the women's crimes, that they were apt, if there weren't women out there, that they were apt to ask the questions that would unearth the ones that came. Obviously, they did, and I mean, the FOCA is an exception, and that was well known. So I just want to make the point, and I think it's still a valid point. Now we have it written into the ICC that there have to be it's a somewhat ephemeral word, but appropriate number of women among judges, and especially women with knowledge of the women's side. Now, as to the question of being a woman, I do feel being a woman was useful in the discussions with my male colleagues, especially because, remember, in the ICTY and in many of these international courts, some of the male judges will come from cultures where women are not treated the way they are here. They're not, maybe they won't come thinking it's okay to rape or abuse, but they will come from cultures in which women have been playing subordinate roles, have not had the kind of opportunities. And so sometimes I think it's, extremely useful for a woman to be able to state in those discussions what is accepted behavior, what's accepted way that you would treat women. I didn't find any problem in feeling, maybe because I've been a judge for 20 years here, and we have cases in the United States too where the women are the victims, and that's part of learning, hopefully learning to be a judge, is to divorce yourself from that aspect. What you may bring as a woman sometimes is a sensitivity to something that's happened and that even you are aware of to women that doesn't happen to men. But I don't think it brings with it the notion that I'm always going to be kind of on the side of the woman. In fact, one of the cases when I got assigned to to the appeal chamber for one case in the ICTY, it was a case in which actually it was Croatians who were accused of burning down a Muslim village. And the key witness was a young woman, no question sincere, I'm sure, in the testimony, but the panel of judges and I reversed. It was the first reversal of a conviction in the ICTY, which didn't bring us great approbation from the prosecutors or from anyone else, because we honestly, in looking at the record, felt that her testimony just didn't hold water, not because she wasn't obviously sincere. She'd gone through a bad experience, not rape, but having her house burned down around her and some of her family members injured, but that consistently in identifying the accuser, her testimony kind of wavered. At one point she wasn't sure, at another point she was sure. Then she talked to her family, then it was a different kind of story. And so, we just, according to the tensions I talked about previously, we felt we could not convict the defendant on that.
So we'd like to invite you to continue this conversation at George Washington Law School Library. And I understand there are people in the room who will help direct people to the 3 blocks there. One's raising their hand, so follow them, and we'll see you.